I learned to breathe where air refuses to enter, between a held breath and a held back truth. I learned to walk in rooms that swallowed my footsteps, to live between the pauses, to sleep beside the edge of a sentence that never finished. Silence sat me down like a prisoner on cold stone and gave me nothing but the echo of my own ribs. It strapped me to a chair of shadows and asked me to confess to a crime I didn't commit. And still, I spoke, quietly at first, not with a voice, but with endurance. They thought silence would bury me. It didn't. It taught me. There's a corridor inside me, lined with cracked mirrors. I pass them nightly, and each reflection is a fragment of a person who once answered to the sound of love. Now those mirrors are maps, fault lines of glass that lead me back to the moment everything collapsed, and forward to the place where I rise. I don't rush anymore. I trace the breakage gently, fingertip to fracture, like a cartographer of wounds. The mirrors whisper, you survived the shattering. Learn the pattern. Build from it. Outside, the air tastes of smoke and iron. Inside, it tastes of dust and old prayers. This is the starvation of sound. The body's quiet rebellion after betrayal. People left with the daylight. Promises evaporated with their shadows. What remained was the hush. Heavy. Faithless. Absolute. There's a weight to silence that sits on the chest like a sleeping animal. Claws sheathed, but ready. I woke each morning with its imprint on my sternum, a bruise the color of thunder. They mistook it for weakness, the way I stopped explaining myself. They mistook it for surrender, the way I folded my words like letters I'd never send. But silence is not the absence of strength. It is the sheath where strength enroots. The quiet things, the patient things, are the ones that crack stone. I made a pact with patience. I told it I would carry its hours if it would carry me through them. It accepted. Patient things always accept, because they know time like a craftsman knows wood. At night, I would lie still and feel the blood move through me like a red mist. It was not rage. Rage is noisy and impatient. This was a slow weather, a climate of recovery. My heart was a closed cathedral, emptied of choirs, lit by the occasional candle of memory. In that vast hush, I swept the floor of promises, gathered the ashes of words that once warmed me, and arranged them into constellations. If If I cannot sing, I told myself, then I will shape the darkness into a map. Silence is prison, yes, but also silence as weapon. The difference is how you hold it. I began to hold it by the handle, not the blade. I organized my days into rituals that did not ask permission. Water, iron, breath. Repetition is a language the world cannot interrupt. Every rep spoke for me when my mouth would not. Every set was a sentence carved into the ribs. Every night run, a paragraph of footsteps stitched into the road. The city didn't cheer. I didn't ask it to. The pavement remembered me anyway. There are stories that only the ground can keep. They said I was distant. Truth, I was precise. Distance is a wound. Precision is a cure. I cut out the noise and kept the pattern. I let the calendar carry my grief forward in a series of measured days. I learned to be a monastery of one. Quiet hallways, strict hours, doors that open only when sworn to. In unspent word, currency for a later war. When I finally speak, I told myself, I will not pay in pennies of outrage. I will pay in gold of certainty. Understand this. I did not choose silence because I had nothing to say. I chose it because it is the only language the storm respects. When the sky fractures, thunder does not explain itself. It arrives. It corrects the air. That is what I am teaching my breath to become. In my silence, you thought I was broken. But silence was only my training ground. The night betrayal entered me. It did not knock. It slipped through the cracks like smoke, like a hand over the mouth of trust. I felt it, not as thunder, but as a whisper that bent the marrow of my bones. Betrayal does not stab once. It bleeds you in increments, slow and surgical. A glance held too long, a promise broken too easily, a word sharpened into a blade and left inside the ribs. I remember the moment clearly, noting because of its drama, but because of its silence. The room did not roar when it happened. It exhaled. The walls leaned closer. The clock ticked louder. My heartbeat became an indictment. And in that pause, I felt the cord of trust snap like a bridge rope cut clean. Everything beneath me collapsed, and I fell. Not into rage, not into noise, but into a silence so absolute, it stole the sound from my own breath. They say betrayal breaks you. That is a lie. Betrayal freezes you. It suspends you mid-motion, caught between disbelief and devastation. I stood there, paralyzed, my words pooling at the base of my throat like stones I could not lift. To answer them, to question them, to scream at them would have been human. But I was no longer human in that instant. I was a shadow, pinned to the wall by the weight of what I now knew. The hands I trusted had become the hands that pushed me toward the grave. The first instinct was to speak, to demand why, to tear open the air with protest. But the air betrayed me too. It refused to carry my voice. I opened my mouth and heard nothing but the hollow gasp of my own ruin. My silence began there, not as choice, but as sentence. And oh, how they mistook it. My stillness became their alibi. My quiet became their comfort. They called it acceptance. They called it surrender, forever. But they had only forced me into apprenticeship under the harshest master. Stillness itself. I never screamed at them. I never begged. I never pleaded my innocence or reminded them of my worth. That is not silence. That is noise in disguise. No. My silence was pure, cold, surgical. A scalpel, cutting me free from the illusion that love was protection. I sealed my tongue because I finally understood. They wanted my words to anchor me to the pain. I would not give them that satisfaction. Instead, I became a graveyard of unspoken truths. I walked among the tombstones of my own sentences. Why lay buried next to, how could you? I trusted you, shared its soil with, I loved you. And every night I visited that cemetery, not with flowers, but with fire. I let the words rot in the ground, and in their decomposition, I grew roots of steel. Silence became my disguise, yes, but more than that, it became my weapon. Because nothing unsettles the guilty more than the absence of a reaction. They wait for rage to validate their crime. They wait for begging to confirm their power. When neither arrives, they are left alone with their reflection. And reflections are merciless. So I carried silence, not as a wound, but as a blade hidden beneath my cloak. They thought I was voiceless. They thought they had won. But betrayal had only carved me hollow, so that silence could fill me. And in that filling, I became something far more dangerous than a man who speaks. I became a man who waits. Silence is not empty. It is a suffocation that hides beneath the skin. It is water rising slow against your chest while your arms remain bound. When I lost my voice to betrayal, I thought silence would be mercy. I thought stillness would heal me. But silence is not mercy. It is a tide. And when you cannot speak, you begin to drown in what you cannot release. Nights became the cruelest tide. I would lie in the dark, eyes open, and hear my thoughts like thunder, with nowhere to strike. Every memory replayed itself with cruel precision. The laughter that once warmed me became sharp. The promises spoken with light became knives carved into echo. And there was no sound to answer it. No roar. No cry. Only the hush of a man sinking deeper into himself. They say drowning is loud, frantic, desperate. But true drowning is quiet. It is the slow resignation of lungs as they accept the water. That was me. Every day I inhaled betrayal until my chest became an ocean of unspoken rage. Each word I never said was a drop, and each drop became a flood. I tried to write, but the ink bled like wounds on the page. I tried to speak, but the air bent and broke before it could carry me. So I sank, lower, colder, into a silence so thick it pressed against my bones like stone walls. The world above me went on laughing, smiling, celebrating. I walked among them like a ghost, carrying my ocean in my chest, every step heavier than the last. They mistook my quiet for peace. They did not see the weight. They could not hear the scream locked beneath the waterline. I avoided mirrors. My reflection had become a stranger. My mouth was there, but sealed like a wound that the cruelest truth. The world loves your words only when they serve it. The moment you fall quiet, it forgets you exist. Perhaps that was the gift hidden in the drowning. To be unseen. To be forgotten. To be forced into the ghostly edges where men rebuild or rot. I chose to rebuild, but not yet. First, I let the silence consume me completely. Because only when you allow yourself to sink to the bottom do you discover what the bottom is made of. And at the bottom of my silence, I found a floor of steel, cold, unyielding, sharp. That floor would not let me sink further. It demanded I stand. But before I could rise, I had to endure the suffocation. I had to let silence crush me, drown me, break me, until I no longer feared it. And when fear dissolved, silence became mine. There is a moment in drowning when the body stops pleading for air and begins to remember it once belonged to earth. My moment came in a room with no witnesses, only the hum of a refrigerator, the pulse in my wrist, and the iron taste of a decision I had not yet made, but could no longer avoid. I stood up, not because the world offered a hand, but because the floor beneath me refused to be anything but solid. The bottom had taught me its lesson. I would not negotiate with water again. I did not hunt for words. I hunted for rhythm. Morning became my metronome. Wake, water, work. I set my day on rails that did not squeal when my feelings tried to derail them. I learned the catechism of repetition. Lifts counted in breath, miles measured in heartbeats, meals weighed like truth. Where grief once sprawled, order drew lines. Where noise once begged for attention, silence placed a finger to its lips and pointed me toward the iron. Silence was no longer a storm over me. It was a forge around me. I felt its heat on the inside of my ribs where the scream had once pressed. That pressure changed shape. It stopped clawing and began hardening. I learned the weight of the bar as if it were a sentence I could carry toward acquittal. My hands, torn and healing, learned to trust pain again, but on my terms this time. Not the kind given by betrayal, the kind chosen by discipline. Out there, they still mistook me for absent. That suited me. Absence is a cloak, and I wore it like a king who has not yet claimed his throne. I moved like a rumor, seen in the blurry edges of early morning, felt in the resolve that clung to my wake. I said little. I explained nothing. I let the calendar become my witness, and the mirror my quiet judge. Each week, the glass admitted the truth. I was less ghost, more man. Less smoke, more steel. There is a craft to rebuilding a self. Hear the smallest hinge of change when it turned. I slept like a soldier at the door, one eye open. Not in fear, but in readiness. The scream inside me quieted. Not because it died, but because it finally had a purpose. It wasn't a plea anymore. It was a current. Direction took it by the throat and led it forward. I started to notice how stillness changes the gravity of a room. Walk in wordless, and the air arranges itself around you. People feel it before they see it. The refusal to be hurried. The absence of apology. I did not posture. I did not need to. Iron gives a man a way of standing that can't be faked. Pain, met on purpose and carried correctly, settles the shoulders like truth. Even the ground hears it. A cadence of steps that say, I am no longer looking for permission. The ghosts grew quieter, not because they forgave me or I forgave them, but because I stopped hosting them. Doors closed, windows latched. The house of my mind learned to secure itself at night. On the mantle I kept a single object, an old cracked mirror. Every morning I faced it. Every morning I spoke the same vow without a sound. We begin again. Nothing clever, nothing dramatic. Just the bone-deep promise of showing up. It is shocking what consistency does to sorrow. It takes it by the hand and walks it at a pace sorrow hates. Sorrow wants a dark room and unmeasured hours. Consistency wants daylight and the clock. Between them I chose the clock. The hands moved whether I did or not. So I moved. And the movement became character. And character, quiet, unadvertised, patient, became the steel of my silence. There were days when the blood mist rose in me. That red weather. Answer. I wasn't hiding. I was hardening. Silence was no longer a room that locked from the outside. It was a vault that I controlled. I kept what mattered. I discarded what begged to be kept. I learned to travel light through heavy days. Understand this. Steel is not born. It is made. Heat it, hammer it, cool it, repeat, until what could be bent learns to hold its line. That was my transformation. Not a miracle, a sequence. Not an eruption, a tempering. I do not glitter. I do not clatter. I do not announce. I hold. And in holding, I discovered the beginning of presence, the kind that does not require volume to be heard, the kind the world senses like weather before a storm. My silence had changed shape. It was no longer a shroud. It was an edge. The next chapter would not be about drowning. It would be about the first sound the blade makes when lifted from the anvil. A small sound, clean, certain. The sound of a man ready to cut himself free. There is a strange sound that comes before the roar. It is not thunder, not fire, not war. It is the smallest fracture in the silence, the first crack in the dam, the whisper that carries more weight than a scream. That was the sound inside me. After so long buried in stillness, I did not explode outward. I did not rise with violence. The first emergence was subtle, kind of subtlety that unsettles more than rage. A look held too long. A presence in the room that bent the air differently. The way my silence no longer sagged with grief, but stood upright, coiled, ready. People could feel it before they understood it. They would glance once, then again, as if catching the scent of iron in the blood mist. It was not a scream of volume. It was a scream of being. Every rep in the gym had been an echo in training. Every step on the pavement had been a word unspoken. Now those echoes began to gather into something audible. Not to ears, but to the marrow of those around me. The quiet man they once dismissed began to haunt their periphery. They looked away faster. They spoke softer. They laughed less loudly when I was near. The scream was forming. The first crack in silence is presence. Presence is louder than noise. I carried myself differently now. Not because I tried, but because the silence inside me had learned its shape. The steel beneath the scars had finished cooling, and its edges began to glint beneath the cloak. Even when I said nothing, my stillness was a declaration. I am here. I did not drown. I did not disappear. You did not bury me. You forged me. They expected words. They wanted explanations. A flood of emotion. Maybe even rage to confirm the story they had written. Every night of drowning had sealed the envelope. Every morning of steel had stamped it with fire. Now the delivery began. Not through my lips, through my being. When silence cracks, the world listens. Not because it wants to, because it must. At first, it was only an echo. A presence that lingered when I left a room. A shift in the air when I entered. The faint hum of something returning. Something growing. But echoes do not stay small. Given time, given weight, they become quakes. And what once sounded like a whisper in the bones became an earthquake that split the ground beneath every step I took. The scream was no longer inside me. It had become the air around me. Every movement, every choice, every silence, it carried the density of thunderclouds before lightning. People didn't just notice anymore. They felt. The way the ground tightens before a storm. The way birds scatter before they see the fire. I became that omen. They had wanted me to remain an echo, a fading ghost in the hallways of memory. But echoes grow teeth when they're ignored too long. I did not remain behind. I surged forward. My silence cracked into a quake, and every betrayer who once dismissed me began to stumble, though I never laid a hand on them. The earthquake was not rage. was inevitability. It was the revelation that I had been remade. Not in noise, not in begging, not in explanations, but in stillness so complete it birthed a storm. I watched them falter when I passed by. Their jokes tasted bitter in their mouths. Their laughter rang hollow against the steel in my posture. I spoke little, but the words I chose carried weight like boulders dropped in water, ripples expanding, unavoidable. That is the scream when it matures. Not a cry for attention, but a gravity that bends the room. In the gym, the iron sang different under my hands. Bars bent to the rhythm of a man who no longer lifted for survival, but for conquest. Each rep slammed into the earth like a declaration. I did not vanish. I rose. My footsteps on the pavement echoed longer, heavier, until I began to hear volume. The ground speaks, the bones answer, the world listens, unwillingly, unavoidably. And I stood in the center, not as victim, not as survivor, but as the tremor they could no longer ignore. When the earth finally stopped trembling, I stood among ruins. Not ruins of buildings, but of illusions. The lies that once held weight had collapsed into dust. The promises that chained me had cracked and fallen away. The people who thought themselves architects of my destruction had fled, leaving only their shadows behind. And in that aftermath, silence did not vanish. It crowned me. The ashes of everything I had lost clung to my skin, gray and bitter. But they did not bury me. They clothed me. I wore them as armor, as proof that I had walked through the fire and carried its remains. Betrayal had thought it was my executioner, but it had only been my coronation. Pain had thought it was my jailer, but it had only forged my scepter. Silence had thought it was my tomb, but it had only built me a throne. I sat, not in arrogance, not in vengeance, but in certainty. The throne was not a chair of gold. It was a seat made of scars. Every scar was a stone. Every memory a pillar. Every moment of drowning, of suffocating, of clawing against invisible walls. They became the architecture of a dominion no one else could enter. A kingdom of one, carved in shadow, built from quiet ashes. The crown was not given. It was taken in stillness, not by conquest of others, but by conquest of self. I bent my grief into metal. I hammered my silence into law. I raised my discipline like banners in a kingdom no traitor could enter. The throne was not recognition from the world. It was recognition from within. The silent man had risen. And in rising, he had discovered sovereignty. From this throne, I did not need to shout. My rule did not require noise. The guilty already trembled at my silence. The betrayers already choked on their reflections. Silence was once my prison. Then it was my forge. Now it is my crown. But even thrones do not last forever. Thrones turn to legend. And legend echoes longer than flesh. I no longer carry the silence as a burden. I carry it as scripture. It is written into my breath, carved into my bones, etched across every scar. The scream that once clawed against my ribs no longer thrashes. It resonates. It has become a hymn, not of noise, but of truth. And truth does not fade. It passes from one wounded soul to the next, from one loner in the night to another. They will say I was quiet. They will say I was broken. They will say I vanished. But listen closer, and you will hear it. The echo of a scream too heavy for sound, too eternal for words. For those still wandering in betrayal's graveyard, my silence is the path. For those still drowning, my scream is the signal fire. For those who think they are forgotten, I am proof that the forgotten do not vanish. They transform. I do not scream for revenge. I do not scream for recognition. I scream because silence itself demanded to be reborn. And in that rebirth, it taught me that true power is not in the volume of your voice, but in the certainty of your presence. The world will forget my words. It will forget my face. But it will not forget the weight, the stillness, the dominion carried in the absence of explanation. That is the legacy, not the scream itself, but the silence it shattered, the silence it rebuilt, the silence it transformed into sovereignty. And when they tell my story, they will not remember the noise. They will remember the atmosphere.